In 1993, Sears Roebuck and Company was the largest retailer on the planet. Not Walmart, not Amazon, Sears. It operated more than 1,800 stores, employed over 300,000 people, and processed so many transactions that at its peak, 1 out of every 2 American households held a Sears credit card. The company had invented the modern department store, the mail-order economy, and in many ways, the entire concept of consumer retail as Americans came to know it. Then, over the next 3 decades, it destroyed itself, not in a single collapse, but through a slow, deliberate series of decisions made by people who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. That is what makes this story different from most corporate autopsies. Sears did not fail because it was blind to the future. It failed because it chose the present over the future, every single time, for 30 years in a row. The executives who ran this company were not stupid. They were in many cases among the smartest financial minds of their generation. And that is precisely what made the outcome so devastating. To understand how a company that once held more institutional knowledge about American consumers than any organization in history, more than the federal government, more than any bank, could file for bankruptcy in 2018 with $5.6 billion in debt and a stock price of 31 cents, you have to go back to the beginning. Because the seeds of the collapse were planted not in the boardroom crises of the 2000s, but in a century of decisions that built something extraordinary and then slowly, methodically, hollowed it out from the inside. Richard Warren Sears was 23 years old when he accidentally started one of the most powerful commercial empires in American history. It was 1886, and he was working as a railroad station agent in North Redwood, Minnesota, a town so small it barely registered on state maps. A Chicago jeweler had shipped a box of gold watches to a local merchant who refused them. Sears bought the entire lot for almost nothing and sold them to other station agents along the rail line for a profit. Within 6 months, he had quit his railroad job. Within a year, he had a catalog. The catalog was the product. Not the watches, not the tools, not the sewing machines. The catalog itself was the revolution. By 1895, it ran to 532 pages. By 1907, Sears was printing 8 million copies a year and mailing them to rural American households where the nearest general store might be 30 miles away across unpaved roads. For families in Kansas, in Alabama, in the hollows of Appalachia, the Sears catalog was not just a shopping guide. It was a connection to the modern world. You could order a piano, a buggy, a house, a complete kit home with pre-cut lumber and blueprints delivered by rail. Between 1908 and 1940, Sears sold approximately 75,000 kit homes across the United States, and several hundred of them are still standing today. This was not retail. This was infrastructure. Sears had become a load-bearing wall in the structure of American commercial life, and it knew it. The company's internal culture in those early decades was defined by an almost fanatical obsession with the customer, with knowing what Americans needed before Americans could articulate it themselves. Julius Rosenwald, who became part owner in 1895 and eventually chairman, built the company's logistics operation into something that rivaled the Postal Service in scale and ambition. The Chicago Fulfillment Center, opened in 1906, covered 40 acres, employed 10,000 people, and could process 900 orders an hour at a time when most of America was still moving at the speed of a horse. The transition from catalog to physical retail happened in 1925 when Sears opened its first freestanding store. Within 5 years, it had more than 300 of them, strategically planted in the suburban rings of growing American cities. The timing was not accidental. Sears had watched automobile ownership explode through the 1920s and understood that a customer with a car was a fundamentally different kind of customer. One who could travel farther, carry more, and spend more in a single visit. While competitors were still thinking in terms of downtown foot traffic, Sears was already designing for the parking lot. It was the company's clearest early demonstration of its core competitive advantage, the ability to see how America was changing and position itself directly in the path of that change. By 1931, Sears retail stores were generating more revenue than its catalog division. By the 1950s, the company had become synonymous with the American middle class in a way that no other retailer has achieved before or since. Kenmore appliances, Craftsman tools, Die-Hard batteries. These were not just product lines, they were household names that carried a specific emotional weight. When a father handed his son a Craftsman wrench on a Saturday morning in a garage in Ohio in 1962, that was a Sears moment. The company had embedded itself into the rituals of American domestic life with a precision that felt less like marketing and more like anthropology. The Sears Tower, completed in Chicago in 1973, stood 1,450 feet tall and was, at the time of its completion, the tallest building in the world. It cost $150 million to build, equivalent to roughly $1 billion today. It housed 7,000 Sears employees across 101 floors, and it was designed to anchor the company's presence in the American economy for the next century.
For the men who commissioned it, the building was not arrogance, it was certainty. The certainty that Sears had already won, that the future belonged to it by right of history and scale, and that the only direction left was up. That certainty was the beginning of the end. In 1981, Sears made a decision that was described at the time as a bold diversification into financial services. It acquired Coldwell Banker, the real estate firm, for $202 million. It acquired Dean Witter Reynolds, the brokerage, for $607 million. It already owned Allstate Insurance, which it had founded in 1931. The plan was to create a one-stop financial ecosystem, a place where an American family could buy a refrigerator, insure their house, invest their savings, and arrange a mortgage, all under one roof. The concept had a name, the Sears Financial Network. It had a slogan that became infamous, "Stocks and Socks." The financial experiment drained management attention and capital from the core retail business for an entire decade. While Sears executives were building branch offices for Dean Witter inside their stores, a company called Walmart was systematically dismantling Sears's price advantage in the Midwest. Sam Walton understood something that Sears had forgotten. The customer is not loyal to you. The customer is loyal to the best deal. Walmart's distribution model, built around massive regional warehouses and just-in-time logistics, allowed it to undercut Sears on everyday goods by margins that quietly, steadily redirected billions of dollars in consumer spending away from Sears and toward the blue and gray box stores spreading across America's suburbs. Sears eventually sold Dean Witter and Coldwell Banker in 1993, booking a one-time gain that masked just how much damage the distraction had caused. But by then, a second competitor had emerged, one that would prove even more existential. Home Depot had opened its first stores in 1979, and by 1990 it was doing to Sears' hardware business what Walmart had done to its soft goods. Craftsman tools and Kenmore appliances were still respected brands, but they were increasingly islands of strength, surrounded by a rising tide of purpose-built competitors who did one thing and did it better than Sears could, while also trying to do everything else. The CEO who arrived in 1995, Arthur Martinez, understood the diagnosis. He closed 113 unprofitable stores in his first year. He killed the catalog, the very instrument that had built the company, in 1993, describing it as a money-losing relic. He focused the business back on apparel and home goods, and for a brief window between 1996 and 1999, it appeared to work. Revenue stabilized. The stock recovered. Business journalists wrote pieces about the Sears comeback with a confidence that turned out to be catastrophically premature. Then the internet happened, and Sears blinked.
Amazon launched in 1995. By 1999, it was selling far more than books, and any serious analyst could see that the mail-order retail model, the exact model that Richard Sears had pioneered 113 years earlier, was being rebuilt digitally at enormous scale and speed. Sears had the brand recognition, the logistics infrastructure, the supplier relationships, and the customer data to become a formidable e-commerce player. It had, in many ways, already invented everything Amazon was doing, just in an analog format. It had been doing it since 1888, and it did almost nothing with that advantage. The pivotal moment came in 2004 when Edward Lampert, a hedge fund manager from Greenwich, Connecticut, engineered the merger of Sears and Kmart for $11 billion. Lampert was not a retailer. He was an investor, and the distinction matters enormously. He viewed Sears Holdings not primarily as a company that sold goods to consumers, but as a portfolio of assets, real estate, brands, inventory that could be systematically monetized. Under his management, Sears sold off its most valuable store locations, licensed out its best brands, and cut capital expenditures to levels so low that by 2012, a walk through the average Sears store felt less like retail and more like triage. Between 2005 and 2018, Sears and Kmart closed more than 3,500 stores. The company spent approximately $6 billion buying back its own stock, money that could have funded store renovations, e-commerce infrastructure, or supply chain modernization. Instead, it flowed back to shareholders, including Lampert himself, who was both the CEO and the largest investor, a conflict of interest so glaring that multiple former executives described the company's internal decision-making process as functionally broken. Departments competed for resources like prisoners fighting over food. The data analytics team, the e-commerce team, the physical retail team, they were structured as separate business units under Lampert's decentralized management philosophy, each one billing the others for internal services, each one optimizing for its own survival rather than the company's. A former senior executive, speaking to the Wall Street Journal in 2013, described it plainly. There's no growth strategy, no human capital strategy, no store investment strategy. Lampert thinks he's the smartest guy in the room, and maybe he is. But being the smartest person in a burning building doesn't mean you're going to get out. Sears filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in October 2018. It was 132 years after Richard Sears bought those watches at a railroad station in Minnesota. At the time of filing, the company had 700 stores and $5.6 billion in liabilities. Its iconic brands, Craftsman, DieHard, Kenmore, were sold off separately, scattered to competitors and private equity firms like furniture from an estate sale. Craftsman went to Stanley Black & Decker for $900 million in 2017. DieHard went to Advance Auto Parts for $200 million in 2019. The bones of the company were worth more apart than together, which is perhaps the clearest possible verdict on what the last 2 decades of management had actually built. As of 2024, fewer than a dozen Sears stores remain open in the United States. The Sears Tower in Chicago was renamed the Willis Tower in 2009. The company had already vacated most of it. What Richard Sears built was not just a store. It was a system for understanding Americans, what they needed, what they aspired to, what they were willing to pay for, and delivering it to them before anyone else could. That system outlasted its founder by a century. It outlasted the catalog, the Depression, 2 world wars, the shopping mall, and the birth of the Internet. What it could not outlast was the moment its own leadership stopped believing in it and started believing that the real value was in the exit. The deepest irony is not that Sears was disrupted by Amazon. It's that Sears was Amazon, a century early. It pioneered the catalog economy, the private label brand strategy, the logistics network, the customer data flywheel. Every competitive advantage that made Amazon dominant in the 2010s had a direct analog in Sears' playbook from the 1910s. The difference is that Amazon built its empire by reinvesting obsessively in the customer experience, while Sears spent its last decade dismantling one. The question worth sitting with is not why Sears failed. The question is whether any institution, no matter how dominant, no matter how deeply embedded in the culture, is immune to the moment it stops asking what the customer actually needs and starts asking what the customer is still willing to tolerate. Because that is never a dramatic collapse. It is always, without exception, a slow and perfectly manageable decline that someone, somewhere, chose not to manage. If this story hit differently than you expected, you know where the subscribe button is.